The American frontier was never supposed to last. It was a promise, one of open skies and boundless opportunity, the kind of freedom most men can only dream of. But all dreams must end. In the late 19th century, America stood at a crossroads. Once seemingly endless, the wild edges of its map began to shrink. Railways cut through ancient forests and lonely plains, bringing steel and smoke to the heart of the untouched wilderness. Towns sprang up overnight, transforming distant horizons into crowded streets. The idea of limitless possibility started slipping away, replaced by fences, boundaries, and laws. Red Dead Redemption 2 places us exactly at the twilight moment between two worlds, caught between the freedom of open skies and the encroachment of modern civilization. We follow Arthur Morgan, a hardened outlaw who sees more clearly than most that his way of life is slipping away. Arthur's journey, filled with violence, loyalty, heartbreak, and, well, redemption, is more than just a tale of one man. It's a story of America itself, struggling and stumbling towards modernity. But here's the truth at the heart of it all. Arthur Morgan's path is tragic precisely because it mirrors the fate of the frontier itself. His battles are those of a dying breed. His losses reflect the nation's surrender to progress. The year was 1893 and Chicago was alive with spectacle. The World's Columbian Exposition was in full swing, a grand celebration of progress, industry, and American ingenuity. Towering white buildings gleamed under electric lights, and the great Ferris wheel spun lazily above the crowds. The fairgrounds were a vision of the future, a testament to how far the nation had come. But in a quiet meeting room, away from the fanfare, a young historian stood before the American Historical Association, ready to deliver an argument redefining how Americans understood their past. Frederick Jackson Turner was not yet a household name, but was about to be. His paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, proposed something bold. The American frontier, he argued, had shaped the nation's very character. It was a crucible in which those brave frontiermen had forged democracy, self-reliance, and innovation. And now, according to the 1890 US Census, it was gone. The frontier had been an omnipresent reality for decades, stretching endlessly westward, promising new beginnings and untold possibilities. The Census Bureau had long mapped the limits of settled land, marking a line between civilization and wilderness. But in 1890, America conquered that wilderness. The government had parceled the land, and the West officially settled. It was more than just a bureaucratic declaration. It was a moment of profound reckoning. If the frontier had shaped America, what would happen now that it was gone? Turner, then only in his early 30s, saw the nation standing at the precipice of change. His frontier thesis was more than just a theory. It was a story of transformation, of reinvention. To Turner, it was a process, a force, an engine of change. It all came down to one essential idea. America was not Europe. The old world had kings, feudal lords, rigid hierarchies, and deeply entrenched traditions. However, in the United States, something different had taken root. At its heart, the frontier was between savagery and civilization. In the wild spaces beyond the settled towns and cities, European customs eroded. A new kind of person emerged, bold, independent, pragmatic. Turner believed that the frontier was where Americans became Americans. It was also where democracy found its most fertile ground. In the cities of the East, power was concentrated in the hands of the elite. Wealth was inherited and social structures were deeply stratified. But out on the frontier, things worked differently. It didn't matter if your father had been a baron in England. Survival depended on the ability to work, adapt, and endure out on the prairie. Turner saw the frontier as a leveling force, a place where class distinction faded. People had to cooperate, make decisions collectively, and rely on the neighbors. This, he argued, gave rise to a uniquely American sense of democracy, one that was direct and deeply tied to the realities of the life on the frontier. But it wasn't just political structure that changed. The frontier shaped the very nature of the American individual. There was no safety net in the West, no well-established institutions, no sprawling bureaucracies. Turner saw this as a fundamental to the American character. The constant movement westward, the never-ending process of pushing the frontier line just a bit further, had bred a certain kind of person, One who valued freedom, distrusted authority, and found solutions rather than waiting for someone else to provide them. The hardships of frontier life, harsh winters, failed crops, and isolation, demanded resilience, practicality, and innovation. Those who couldn't adapt didn't survive. The frontier was unpredictable and ever-changing. The land itself forced settlers to find new ways to live, new ways to build, and new ways to think. This constant process of improvisation, of solving problems with what little was available, became ingrained in the national psyche. But now that the unknown had been conquered, Turner worried about what that meant for the country's future. If the frontier had been a great engine of American vigor, what would happen when that engine stopped running? In the loss of the frontier, Turner saw a looming threat, or a physical one. Not an invasion or an economic collapse, but something deeper, something more existential. Stagnation, decline. Without the vast open spaces of the West, the call to adventure, and the necessity of reinvention, would America lose the qualities that had made it unique? That was the question that lingered, and it wasn't just an abstract concern for historians and intellectuals. It was something Americans everywhere had to grapple with, a sudden and profound cultural shift, an uneasy sense that the world had changed in a way they didn't fully understand. The frontier had always been a promise, an escape valve, a horizon of infinite possibilities. There was always another place to go, another opportunity to seize, another chance to start over. And now, Americans had to face a new reality for the first time. There was nowhere left to run. The people who had existed on the fringes, those who thrived in the spaces beyond the boundaries of law and order, now found themselves exposed. The outlaw, more than anyone, was a creature of the frontier. He or she had survived in that nebulous space between law and lawlessness, between civilization and the wild. The outlaw was the ultimate expression of Turner's frontier spirit. Independent, self-reliant, answering to no authority but their own. The outlaw lived on their own terms, forged their own path, and rejected the structures that settled society imposed. But as the frontier closed, that way of life became impossible. The world no longer had room for them. And nowhere is that conflict more vividly realized than in Red Dead Redemption 2. Arthur Morgan and the Vanderlyn gang are relics of a dying age. They have lived by the rules of the Old West, rules that no longer apply. Civilization is pressing in from all sides, bringing railroads, telegraphs, banks and laws. There's no more room for the outlaw, or space for the drifter, the fugitive and the free spirit. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Arthur is more than just a protagonist. He's the story's very emotional core, the lens through which we experience the final dying moments of the Wild West. He's a product of a world disappearing before his very eyes, caught between the lawless past and the unrelenting march of civilization. Arthur was not born into an ordinary life. Often at a young age, he found his family not in blood, but in the Vanderlyn gang. Dutch took him in, raised him, shaped him, taught him what it meant to live outside the law and embrace the outlaw's code. Loyalty, survival, and self-reliance. And for most of his life, that was enough. The gang was his home. The outlaw life was the only life he had ever known. And for a time, he believed in it. He believed in Dutch's dream of freedom, of carving out a space beyond the reach of rules and restrictions, of living by their own laws. When he was free, or at least when he thought he was, the land stretched endlessly before him. The open plains, the towering mountains, the dark forests. It was a world unshaped by laws or fences. It belonged to no one, or rather, it belonged to those with the will to take it. Arthur was one of those men. He moved through the wilderness with the confidence and certainty. He could go where he pleased, take what he wanted, and leave nothing behind but spent bullet casings, and the dust his horse's hooves kicked up. The world was his for the taking, and it never occurred to him that it could be otherwise. This was the great promise of the frontier, the myth that men like Arthur had built their lives around. As long as there was open space ahead, no law, government or institution could ever contain him. The outlaw was the last truly free man. He didn't answer to kings, presidents or bankers. Richard Slotkin, a historian of the American West, called it regeneration through violence. The idea that the frontier was a place where civilization was imposed through force, where order was carved out of chaos by men willing to pull the trigger first. This was the code Arthur lived by, not because he was cruel, not because he took pleasure in bloodshed, but because he saw it as necessary. Arthur knew that the strong survived and the weak were forgotten in the world. If he wanted to be free and protect his gang and family, he had to be the kind of man the world feared, the type of man who did what had to be done. For all the myths built around the West and the stories of endless opportunity and self-made men, there was always a deeper, darker reality lurking beneath. The promise of boundless freedom had always been a fragile illusion, masking a history of displacement, destruction, and violence. The very foundations of American expansion were soaked in blood. As Arthur's world closed around him, so does his understanding of that truth. Manifest destiny, the idea that westward expansion was inevitable and divinely sanctioned, was the incredible story America told itself. A tale of heroism, of civilization pushing ever forward, of noble pioneers taming the wilderness and spreading democracy across the continent. It was a story meant to inspire, to justify, to cleanse history of its sins. The phrase itself was coined in 1845 by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, a rallying cry for the expansionist ambitions of a young nation that believed it had a right, even a duty, to claim the land before it. But it was always a myth, a convenient fiction draped over the uncomfortable reality of conquest. And in Red Dead Redemption 2, this collision of forces is laid bare. Rains fall and eagle flies. Members of the Wapiti Lakota know what it means to live on the losing side of the great national story. They are not obstacles to progress, they are victims. Historian Richard White, in It's Your Fortune and None of My Own, argues that the West was never the land of radical individualism it pretended to be. It was never a place where man could survive on grit alone. Instead, it was a web of economic, social, and structural interdependence. No one was truly free from the systems that shaped them, and Arthur Morgan, for all his belief in self-reliance, is no exception. He depends on the gang, on trade, on stolen money, on the fragile relationships he maintains with fences and informants. And the more the world changes, the more he realizes just how little control he actually has. The self-sufficient cowboy was a myth, just like the limitless frontier itself. And then there's the violence. Every myth needs its heroes, and in the mythology of the West, those heroes were the gunfighters, the outlaws and the cowboys, who tamed the wilderness with bullets and bravado. This was a great romanticization of the Western expansion. The violence was justified, but in Red Dead Redemption 2, the fantasy unravels. Arthur's story is soaked in blood, but none of it is clean, none of it is righteous. The violence he commits is usually ugly, brutal, and ultimately meaningless. It destroys more than it builds. It takes from the innocent just as much from the guilty. Most of all, it takes a toll on Arthur himself. The men he kills do not make the world better. The train robberies and bank heists do not bring lasting freedom. The gang's way of life does not triumph, it collapses, as it was always going to. The Frontier's mythology promised that men like Arthur could be free and impose their will upon the world, with nothing but grit and a gun. But that was never true. The real outlaws of the West, the Billy the Kids, the Jesse Jameses, the Butch Cassidys, lived in a world that would not sustain them forever. They thrived in the lawless gaps of a young and expanding nation. But as railroads stretched across the continent, as telegraphs tightened the grip of civilization, those gaps disappeared. But the West's transformation was not confined to cities like Saint Denis in the game, or its real-world parallels New Orleans or Chicago. The wilderness itself was being shaped, controlled and remade in an image of progress. The railroads were the most evident sign. Once the frontier had been defined by vast empty spaces, places where a man could disappear, where distance was a kind of freedom. But railroads had a way of making the world smaller. In Nature's Metropolis, historian William Cronon describes the railroad as a great force that imposed order in the West, dividing land into neat, manageable parcels, turning wilderness into property, and pushing the frontier closer to civilization's grip with every mile of track. These steel veins cut through the landscape, binding to the growing industrial economy of the East. No longer could the West exist as a separate, untamed world. It was being absorbed, assimilated, and converted into something else. And it had all happened quickly. In the early 19th century, railroads were a novelty. Their reach limited to the urban centers of the East Coast. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad began in 1828, and was one of the first modest networks meant to connect local economies. However, after the Civil War, the ambition of railroads grew exponentially. The significant undertaking of the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, linking the Atlantic and the Pacific with an unbroken chain of iron. What had once been an arduous journey across mountains, deserts, and lawless plains that took months of hardship and danger could now be completed in a week. To some it was a triumph, the realization of manifest destiny, the ultimate proof of American ingenuity and determination. But beneath their triumph was something else. Historian Richard White, in Railroaded, argues that the transcontinental railroads were not just a tool of progress, but instruments of greed, corruption, and destruction. The men who controlled them, industrialists like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, and Leland Stanford, became unimaginably wealthy, often through ruthless exploitation. Railroads controlled land, dictated economies, and decided who would rise and fall in fortune, and they were not built without cost. Railroads accelerated the natural world's destruction at a never-before-seen pace. The vast buffalo herds that had once dominated the Great Plains were slaughtered by the millions, so that rail lines could stretch unimpeded. The great forests of the West were felled to fuel steam engines and lay wooden ties. Indigenous nations who had lived on these lands for generations and generations found themselves trapped, cut off in the way of life shattered by forces they could not resist. The West is no longer a place of infinite escape. It has a series of defined routes, a network of control. The telegraph wires only reinforced the fact. Once a man could vanish into the wilderness, his past forgotten, his crimes left behind. But now with a single message, his name, his description, and his reputation could travel faster than he could ride. Once a localized force with little reach, law enforcement had become something else. An organized system, a network stretching from one coast to another. The railroad was a cage, the telegraph wires chains. The oil derricks are monuments to a world where men like Arthur Morgan were no longer needed, swallowed by industry, by law, by forces too large to fight. And yet for all the signs and warnings, Dutch Vanderlyn still believed they could outrun it. But Arthur knew better, because civilization wasn't just creeping in from the coasts, it was hunting them. Law enforcement in frontier territories was at best inconsistent. At worst, it was corrupt, inefficient, or simply non-existent. But the government didn't always need its own lawmen. Sometimes it could just hire them, and few were as ruthless and relentless as the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Founded in 1850 by a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton, the agency began as a small private security firm in Chicago. At first, its purpose was simple: protection, surveillance, and investigation. But as the United States expanded, as railroads, banks, and industrial fortunes grew, the Pinkertons found their role shifting. They became the enforcers of order in a chaotic world, a private police force for the powerful. In Red Dead Redemption 2, those forces given flesh and bone in the form of Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross. Milton in particular is a man who seems almost amused by the gang's struggle. He doesn't fear them, doesn't hate them, he simply does his job. Because for him, this isn't personal, it's inevitable. That more than anything is what makes the Pinkertons so terrifying. They don't fight for justice or revenge, they fight because the world is moving forward, and people like Arthur Morgan are standing in its way. This makes their role in the game much more than just another band of lawmen chasing down criminals. They're not men so much as they embody industrial era law enforcement. Impersonal, corporate funded, and efficient. The Vanderlyn gang may think they are fighting for the freedom and the way of life. But the Pinkertons don't see them as warriors or adversaries. They see them as outdated, they see them as pests, and pests, given enough time, are invariably exterminated. In the last game's act, Arthur Morgan understands the truth long before his mentor does. He knows they're not fighting for their survival anymore, they're just waiting for the end to come. But Dutch Vanderlyn refuses to see it. To understand Dutch is to understand the last desperate gasps of American frontier. He's not just a leader of the gang, he's the ideological core, the father figure who offers his outcasts something bigger than themselves. He's a dreamer, a visionary, a prophet preaching the old gospel of the West. And like all prophets, his power lies in his ability to make others believe. Dutch does not lead by force, he does not rule with fear, his actual weapon is his voice. And with it, he can make men follow him into hell. He speaks of freedom, self-reliance, and a world without chains or masters. His gang is more than a collection of thieves and outlaws. It is a movement, a last stand against the crushing advance of civilization. Or at least, that's what he wants them to believe. Historian Eric Hobsbawm, in Bandits, describes how successful outlaw leaders throughout history have thrived through cunning or ruthlessness and ideology. They position themselves as champions of the oppressed, fighters against the corrupt forces of empire, industry, and government. Jesse James claimed to be a Southern Avenger striking back at Northern financiers. Pancho Villa cast himself as a revolutionary, robbing the rich to feed the poor. Dutch Vanderlyn follows the same tradition. He's not simply a criminal, he's a self-styled revolutionary who speaks the language of resistance. And he believes it, at least in the beginning. Dutch's obsession with freedom runs deep, woven into nearly every speech and rallying cry. He references Thomas Paine, the great revolutionary thinker, quoting passages about tyranny and independence. He sees himself as a man outside of time, an outlaw not just by law but by principle. But revolutionary rhetoric is often just that, rhetoric. Behind every great cause there are human ambition, flaws and failures. Dutch speaks of liberation but he thrives on control. He claims to fight for the gang, but the gang fights for him more and more. Dutch's loyalty is tested repeatedly, and he fails each time. When Hosea, his oldest and most trusted friend, cautions him against reckless decisions, Dutch dismisses him. When Arthur, the man who has stood by his side for years, begins questioning him, Dutch turns against him. When John, who has risked everything for the gang, needs his help, Dutch abandons him. The man who preaches loyalty, who swears that the gang is his family, is the first to cast him aside when they no longer serve his purpose. And yet, Dutch never stopped talking about freedom. He never stops promising that salvation is just on the horizon, just one step away. His great dream, a world where they can finally be free, never materializes because it was never real to begin with. History is filled with the man who believed in a one last score. Butch Cassidy's wild bunch spent years chasing it, robbing banks and trains with the hope that just one more job would be enough to escape the reaches of the law. Instead, each heist only pushed them deeper into trouble, until they finally ran out of places to run. Dutch is no different. His plan is always the same. One more robbery, one more haul, and they'll be free. With a modicum of trust, they can make it to Tahiti and become mango farmers. But every heist only tightens the noose. Every act of defiance brings the Pinkerton closer. Every failed scheme drives another wedge between him and those who have followed him for years. In the end, when all his plans have failed, the gang has fallen apart, and there's no one left to follow him. Dutch does the only thing left for a man like him to do. He disappears. He can't face reality. He can't reckon with the truth that the frontier was never the paradise he imagined, and freedom was never more than an illusion. He spent his life chasing myths. If Red Dead Redemption 2 peels back the layers of the frontier myth, exposing the hypocrisy and contradictions at its core, then Blood Meridian takes a knife to it. McCarthy's 1985 novel, Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, is widely considered one of the most brutally honest literary depictions of the American frontier, a world not of noble cowboys and courageous outlaws, but of indiscriminate slaughter, senseless cruelty and violence that is neither righteous nor redemptive. The book follows an unnamed teenager, known only as the Kid, who drifts aimlessly to the US-Mexico borderlands in the mid-1800s, eventually falling with the Glanton Gang, a group of mercenaries hired by Mexican authorities to massacre and scalp Native Americans. They're not protectors, they're not lawmen, they're killers profiting off violence, butchering not only the Apache they were contracted to exterminate, but anyone who crosses their path. Judge Holden is at the novel's center, a figure who is less a man than an idea made flesh. He's intelligent, articulate, and terrifying. Judge Holden does not kill for money, vengeance, or survival. He kills because, in his view, war is the natural state of humanity. He preaches that violence is not an aberration, but the foundation of existence itself. And in McCarthy's world, there's no escaping it. Unlike the traditional westerns, Blood Meridian offers no redemption, hero, or last stand against evil. The Kid is not a gunslinger in search of honor. He is a witness to the unraveling of everything civilization claims to stand for. The novel's world is chaos, shaped by those willing to embrace brutality, and burned into history by those who survive it. McCarthy's depiction of violence is unflinching, and in doing so he forces the reader to confront what the Western genre had long refused to acknowledge. There is no morality in the violence of Blood Meridian. It is not good versus evil, it is not law versus lawlessness, it simply is. That is what makes it so horrifying. In his final chilling monologue, Judge Holden makes a declaration that echoes long after the novel ends. War, he says, is eternal. It is the ultimate game, and those who refuse to play it are doomed. Civilization may claim to be building something more significant, but beneath it all, the same primal forces still reign. The frontier was never about freedom. It was never about opportunity. It was about domination, about survival, about who was willing to commit the most violence to shape the world in their image. This is a true legacy of the American West, according to McCarthy. It's not Dutch Vanderlyn's dream of some lost paradise, the outlaw fantasy of living beyond the reach of law and order, or the cowboy's illusion of noble self-reliance. The West was never a land of myths, it was a land of slaughter. Where civilization did not triumph over savagery, it simply replaced one kind of brutality with another. Dutch could never accept that truth. Arthur Morgan in the end saw it, and Judge Holden, he knew it all along. While Blood Meridian may read like a nightmare, it is not a work of pure fiction. The horrors depicted in the novel are drawn directly from historical events, from the very real Glanton gang. This mercenary outfit prowled the US-Mexico borderlands in the late 1840s and early 1850s, making their fortune through blood. Led by John Joel Glanton, these men were hired killers. The job sanctioned by local Mexican authorities, who promised them payment for every native scalp they delivered. The official justification was protection. Frontier settlements needed to be defended from Apache raids, and the Glanton gang was there to do the dirty work. But greed had a way of stripping away pretense. They did not stop with the warriors, they didn't stop with the combatants. They scalped indiscriminately, men, women, children, anyone they could kill and turn in for reward. They massacred entire villages, took what they pleased, and left nothing behind but fire and bone. McCarthy relied heavily on the first-hand historical records in crafting this novel, particularly My Confession, a memoir written in the 1850s by Samuel Chamberlain, a soldier and drifter who claimed to have crossed paths with Glanton and his men. Chamberlain's account, filled with explicit descriptions of the crime, provided a raw historical material that McCarthy could strip down to its most elemental form, transforming it into something even more terrifying. On the surface, Dutch, the outlaw, the idealist, the dreamer, clinging to his fantasy of freedom, and Holden, the cold philosopher of war, a creature of endless knowledge and boundless brutality, could not be more different. Still at their core, they share something fundamental, the ability to lead, inspire, and shape the world around them through sheer force of will. Where Dutch Vanderlyn is a man whose power lies in his voice, Judge Holden, on the other hand, is something else entirely. Where Dutch is fallible, Holden is absolute. He doesn't need to convince his followers that he is right. They already know that resistance is futile. Holden is a man without doubt, hesitation, or even the pretense of morality. Dutch uses words to conceal his true nature. Holden uses them to reveal the world as he sees it. Harold Bloom, one of the most renowned literary critics of the last century, described Holden as the embodiment of pure evil. He's intelligent, articulate, and mesmerizing in his ability to justify the horrors that he commits. Unlike Dutch, who hides behind the illusion of nobility, Holden makes no excuses. He does not believe in salvation or justice, he believes only in power, and power comes from violence. And yet, like Dutch, he inspires. He draws men to him who perhaps do not fully understand what they are following. Because Holden offers something beyond mere leadership, he provides understanding. He promises not safety, not escape, but truth. The truth that war is eternal, that might makes right, that the world is nothing more than a stage for the violent to carve their names into history. This is what makes both Dutch and Holden so dangerous. They do not merely lead men to destruction, they make them believe that destruction is necessary. Dutch does it with the dream of freedom, Holden does it with the promise of revelation. Dutch seeks a paradise that doesn't exist, Holden knows that the paradise was never real to begin with. And in the end, they go opposite ways. Dutch simply disappears when his vision finally collapses. When his word no longer holds power, he's a man who cannot exist outside of his own myth. And so when the myth dies, so does he, at least in the eyes of the world. Holden, however, doesn't need to disappear. He dances and celebrates. He doesn't need to flee because he's already won. Violence is eternal, and so is he. Dutch Vanderlyn and Judge Holden represent two sides of the same coin. But where Dutch failed, Holden endured. Because Dutch needed his people to believe. Holden only needed them to obey. For all his years as an outlaw, Arthur's story is not about defiance, but about reckoning. It is about the slow, agonizing realization the world he believed in was never what he thought it was. And in the end, when faced with his own mortality, Arthur chose to leave something behind, to carve meaning out of the ruins. But what if he hadn't? What if Arthur had not found redemption? What if instead of seeking to do the right thing by John Marston, by Abigail, by Jack, by the people who might yet escape, he had simply kept drifting, lost in the chaos of a dying world? That is the kid's story. Harold Bloom once argued that the kid is a tragic figure precisely because he holds onto humanity's faintest remnants in a world without a place for them. Unlike Judge Holden and the Glanton gang, the kid doesn't revel in violence. He doesn't seek it out, but he cannot escape it. It's the water he swims in, the air he breathes. Literary scholar Stephen Fry describes the kid's journey as one of existential wandering, a futile search for meaning in a landscape that offers nothing but horror. He moves through the deserts of the US-Mexico borderlands, encountering men who kill without hesitation, who burn and mutilate and destroy because there's nothing else to do. And every time he tries to leave, to step away from the bloodshed, the world drags him back. There's no redemption for the kid, because there never could be in McCarthy's vision. The West is not a place where good men can change their fate. It is a void, an abyss, a place where survival is the only virtue. Arthur Morgan and the kid are both men born in violence. They both live by the gun, shaped by the lawless brutality of the frontier. But where the stories end, where they diverge, is what makes them such powerful counterpoints. They're both trapped in worlds where violence is not just necessary, it is inescapable, and both in their own ways understand that their stories they were told about freedom, honor and the West were lies. However, only one of them does something with that knowledge. Arthur chooses, he cannot undo the harm he has done, bring back the lives he has taken, or change the man he was, but he can decide what kind of man he will be. In those final moments, with the sun setting on his life and the world Arthur once knew, he does not fight for himself, he does not grasp for some last shred of power, he lets go. He gives what little he has left to those who still have a chance. The kid does not get that choice. He tries, perhaps. He wanders, drifts, searching for something beyond the violence, beyond the cruelty, but the world does not let him leave. In the novel's chilling, ambiguous conclusion, he meets Judge Holden one last time. The judge welcomes him back, and the story fades to black. Whether Holden kills the kid, or whether he consumes him in some darker way, is left unsaid, but the meaning is clear. There is no escape. Arthur Morgan's story is a rare, fronted tale that allows for something more than nihilism, something more than survival at all costs. But unlike the kid, he still has hope. He fights to leave something behind, something that may last. And in the end, his fate was never his own. For all his strength and resolve, he was never faster in the world that was closing around him, never faster than his past decisions coming to haunt him. But that doesn't mean he was wrong to try. Arthur Morgan dies alone on a mountaintop, the sky burning in hues of gold and crimson, the wind whispering through the grass. He has spent his life running, chasing dreams that were never really his, fighting for a future that never came, and yet in his final moments, he stops. He watches the horizon, the last dying edge of a frontier, where men like him were supposed to carve their destinies, and then he's gone. But for one fleeting moment, before the end, he was free.